The Quran was not composed in the high-register poetic speech of oral compositions like the Mu'allaqat, but in the vernacular dialects of Mecca and Medina, لَعَلِّكُمْ تَعْقِلُونَ, and linguists call this variety of Arabic Old Hijazi, whose features include the almost complete lack of Hamza. And in this video I want to talk about how we know that, aside from the multiple grammarians that talk about the language of the Quraysh being lacking in its Hamza, oftentimes comparing it to the Tamim region, which does retain the Hamza. However, all of these grammatical sources are some 100 years after the composition of the Quran, and so it can only ever be a starting point. Another starting point can be analyzing the underlying Uthmanic rasam, which is a writing system that cannot write down Hamza whatsoever. And in order to understand why it can't, we have to understand the development of Alif as a letter. See, Alif was used very differently in the old Nabatean inscriptions written in the Imperial Aramaic script some 700 years before the time of the Prophet. As you can see, Alif is the only letter used to write down the Hamza, such as in Nabatean Dhi'bo for Classical Arabic Dhi'bun, Thu'aybo for Thu'aybun, Hane'o for Hane'un, and so on and so forth. This practice would continue up until around the 6th century CE, but not even 100 years later, and we have a totally different spelling rule for Aleph, in which it's mainly used to write down long A, like we see today. The Quranic scholar Werner Diem makes a very convincing argument that this change in spelling came about from a change in pronunciation within the Hijaz, in which Hamza is dropped after a vowel, subsequently lengthening it, like the word for head, ras, becoming ras. When this sound change occurred, the Aleph was no longer associated with this now silent Hamza, but then was just used to indicate long A, even in places that didn't originally have Hamza, like in Nas, people. This sound change also occurred if Hamza was before an E or an U, lengthening it to E and U, which is why you have words like question and asking, su'al and sa'il, being spelled like they should be pronounced as su'al and sa'il without the Hamza. Another big difference between how Arabic is written in the Quran versus other texts is that post-consonantal Aleph is lost without a trace and is not transcribed at all in the Quranic orthography, such as in af'ida being written as though it should be afida, the word for hearts. So we can see that at the very least, the Uthmanic rasam and the way it writes down Arabic comes from a tradition that didn't originally have Hamza. But does that mean that it wasn't pronounced in the Quran? Of course not. We have to add the additional point that none of the recitations of the Quran we have today, the qira'at, consistently preserve Hamza. So for instance, in the Hafs version, known for preserving the Hamza, the word for prophet is Nabiyyu, despite the fact that Hamza should be there, as can be seen by the Hebrew cognate Navi, as well as in the Nafi tradition, which does have Hamza in Nabi'u. Another example is the word for to ridicule, Huzuwan, which is read with a Hamza by Ibn Kathir, Abu Amr, Ibn Amir, and Al-Kisai, and without by everyone else. And so this inconsistent representation of Hamza in the various qira'at indicate that its presence in the reading traditions isn't due to systematic sound change that we see in other aspects of linguistic evolution, but came about from later traditions drawing from other dialects of Arabic by analogy.